In 2012, America made a decision that had never been tried before. Not a new law, not a wildlife program. They blew up two dams. Two massive concrete structures that had stood for nearly a century, gone. The Elwha River in Washington state was suddenly free for the first time since 1913. And nobody knew what would happen next. Scientists had theories, locals had doubts. The river itself had no plan, just water, moving the way it hadn't moved in 100 years. Some researchers thought it might take decades for anything meaningful to change. Some thought the damage was simply too old, too deep, too permanent. They were wrong. Within 5 years, something came back to that river that stunned every scientist watching. Not slowly, not quietly, that IT came back like it had never left. And what it did to that river, to that valley, to that entire ecosystem, changed how the world thinks about rivers forever. The Elwha River runs through the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. It starts high in the mountains, cold, clear, and fast. Then it drops down through forests so thick the sunlight barely reaches the ground. For thousands of years, this river was alive. Not just with water, with salmon, millions of them. Every year, they pushed upstream from the Pacific Ocean, fighting the current, fighting gravity, going home. The lower Elwha Clallam tribe had lived alongside this river for generations. Their entire culture was built around it. The salmon wasn't just food. It was identity, that IT was ceremony, that IT was everything. Then, in 1913, a private power company built a dam in O fish ladder. No environmental study, no permission from the tribe. Just concrete and money. A second dam went up in 1927. Together, they blocked the salmon from 70 miles of river. 70 miles of spawning habitat, gone overnight. The runs that once numbered in the hundreds of thousands collapsed to almost nothing. By the late 1900s, biologists counting returning salmon weren't measuring in thousands anymore. They were counting individual fish. Some years, fewer than 100 made it back. A river that had sustained life for millennia was now barely breathing. Tribal elders who had grown up eating salmon watched their grandchildren grow up without it. The dams were only producing a tiny fraction of the region's power needs. The damage was enormous. The benefit was almost nothing. And yet, they stood for decades, until one man decided he had seen enough. His name was Robert Olofsson, a restoration coordinator for the lower Elwha Clallam tribe. He had spent years documenting what the dams had done. Not just the fish, the riverbed, the sediment, to the entire valley downstream. What he found was worse than anyone had publicly admitted. Behind the two dams, nearly a century of sediment had built up, millions of tons of it. Gravel, sand, silt. All the material a healthy river carries downstream to feed its estuary. Trapped, locked behind concrete walls. The riverbed below the dams had actually sunk. Without fresh sediment coming through, the banks were eroding. The estuary at the river's mouth was shrinking. The whole system was slowly collapsing from the inside. Olofsson brought this evidence to federal officials in the 1990s. He wasn't the only one pushing. Biologists, tribal leaders, and environmental lawyers have been filing reports for years. The argument wasn't just ecological, that it was legal. The original dam permit from 1913 had never properly addressed tribal rights. That single detail would take decades to resolve. But in 1992, something shifted. Congress passed the Elwha River Ecosystem and Fisheries Restoration Act. It was a quiet piece of legislation. Few people noticed it, but it set in motion the largest dam removal project in American history. It still took 20 more years of planning, funding battles, and engineering challenges. 20 years. But on September 17, 2011, the first explosives were placed, and engineers made a discovery inside that dam that nobody had expected. Inside the Elwha Dam, engineers found something that stopped them cold. The concrete wasn't just OLD, it was deteriorating from within. Sections that were supposed to be solid had developed internal voids. Hollow spaces where water had been silently eating through the structure for decades. The dam hadn't been safe for years. Nobody had told the public. Demolition moved forward immediately. The Elwha Dam came down first in 2012. The Glines Canyon Dam followed shortly after. When the concrete finally broke and the water was released, engineers braced for chaos. That sediment, all those millions of tons locked behind the dams, was now free. The initial rush was thick and dark. The river ran brown for weeks. Some biologists watching downstream were genuinely alarmed. They worried the sediment pulse would bury everything, smother the riverbed, kill whatever fragile life had managed to survive below the dams. For a while, it looked like their fears were justified. Fish monitoring stations recorded almost nothing moving through the lower river. The water was too turbid, too unstable. Volunteers and tribal members who had waited decades for this moment stood on the banks watching a river that looked, frankly, destroyed. One tribal elder, a man named Raymond Sinsmeyer who had fought for dam removal since the 1970s, walked to the riverbank the week after demolition. He stood there for a long time, said nothing. Then he turned and said quietly, he wasn't sure they had done the right thing. That was October 2012 spring of 2013. Something appeared in the river that changed everything. The first salmon appeared in March 2013, not hundreds, not thousands, just a few, pushing upstream through water that was still cloudy with sediment, moving through a riverbed that barely resembled a functioning ecosystem. But they were there. Biologist Mike McHenry had been monitoring the Elwha for over 2 decades. He had tagged fish, counted reds, filled out reports showing years of near-zero returns. When he saw those first salmon moving past the old dam site, past concrete foundations that were still being cleared, he later said he had to walk away from his equipment for a moment. He couldn't quite process what he was seeing. But here was the part nobody had predicted. Those salmon weren't just returning to the lower river. They were pushing further than any fish in living memory had gone. They were entering sections of the Elwha that hadn't seen a salmon in 100 years. Stretches of river that older tribal members had only heard about in stories. Places their grandfathers had fished, now holding salmon again. By 2014, researchers started noticing something strange happening along the riverbanks. Vegetation that had been sparse and struggling was beginning to change. The chemistry of the soil was shifting because salmon don't just bring themselves back to a river. They bring the ocean with them. Their bodies carry marine nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, deep into the forest when they die. Bears were moving into areas they hadn't used in decades. Eagles were appearing in numbers that surprised even experienced wildlife trackers. But none of that was the most unexpected part. In 2016, researchers checked something they hadn't thought to measure until now. And what they found in the riverbed itself rewrote the timeline entirely. In 2016, researchers pulled sediment cores from the riverbed. They were looking for signs of ecosystem recovery. What they found instead was a timeline. Buried in the sediment layers were salmon bones. Ancient ones, thousands of years old. The river was essentially showing them its own history. And the recovery happening above those layers was tracking almost exactly the same pattern as the original ecosystem. The river wasn't rebuilding randomly. It was rebuilding itself the way it had been built the first time. By 2017, 5 years after demolition, the numbers were staggering. Chinook salmon returns had increased by over 150% compared to pre-removal baselines. Coho were pushing 70 miles upstream. Steelhead were being recorded in tributaries that hadn't held fish in living memory. The riverbed, once compacted and barren, was now covered in clean, spawning gravel, deposited naturally by the river itself. The estuary at the river's mouth, the one that had been shrinking for decades, had grown by over 30 acres, new land. Built by the river from the sediment, it had finally been allowed to carry again. Raymond Sinsmeyer, the elder who had stood on that bank in 2012 doubting everything, went back to the river in 2017. He watched Chinook pushing upstream past the place where the dam once stood. He said nothing for a long time. Then he knelt down and put his hand in the water. 100 years of damage, reversed in 5, The Elwha didn't just recover, IT remembered. And what happened here is now being studied by governments on every continent with a dead river and a dam they're afraid to remove. If this story made you see rivers differently, there are dozens more like it. Every one of them just as surprising.